So the question that was asked was, what is mindfulness from the perspective of Vedanta philosophy? So let's start by getting some sort of definition of the word mindfulness, and that is that mindfulness is a state of active, open attention to the present. This state encompasses observing one's thoughts and feelings without judging them as good or bad. So this is coming from the Psychology Today website. So the question is, how does this relate to Vedanta philosophy in terms of the inner equipments of mind and intellect and the way that we should be directing our attention? So the first thing that we want to understand is that, generally speaking, the term mindfulness is used, or it's presented as a way of keeping the mind relatively calm. So you may have heard of mindfulness-based stress reduction. So this is where a lot of mindfulness is directed, whether it's in schools to keep kids relatively calmer in the classroom, whether it's in the corporate world to keep people stress-free, in prisons and so forth. So as far as that goes, Vedanta would say, by all means use it. Anything that you can do as a means of keeping the mind relatively calm, employ it in your daily life. And so as a sort of a short-term stress reducer, it may be effective. Anytime we withdraw our attention from those things which are causing us to be stressed out, or circular thinking, we're going around and around in circles, anything we do to break that flow of attention off is going to be good. So anything that calms the mind is useful. But generally speaking, mindfulness does not address the underlying causes of stress. So in that sense, as a practice, it's incomplete. So there are two ways that we can understand this incompleteness. The first is that it's divorced from an analytical or ethical framework. If you have some familiarity with mindfulness, it has its roots in the Buddhist tradition. So it's interesting that the Buddhist tradition doesn't just say develop a practice for concentration. This is not what Buddhism is primarily about. Buddhism is primarily about transcending the ego. And the method to do that, the Buddhist tradition is very strong on the idea of compassion. When you look at what they describe as the noble truths, one of them is that through right action and through right thinking, you can get yourself out of suffering. So the way to alleviate suffering, the way to get out of your own stress, is to go beyond the ego, which is done by having a thought and a feeling towards others in the sense of compassion, by realizing the truth that there is no ego, and so forth. The problem with mindfulness, as it tends to have been sort of commodified and franchised and consumerized and then sold in a mass market, is that these incredibly vital underpinnings to the practice of developing concentration are not present. And so as a result, it doesn't address the underlying causes of stress. So we often use the receipt, reaction, response mechanism as a way of describing this. We receive stimuli from the external environment that reacts with our inner personality, and then we respond back into the world. So if our reaction is one of stress, then we need to recognize that there are two factors that are contributing towards that stress. The first factor, we use the word trigger. So there is a trigger from the external environment. That trigger reacts with a cause in my inner personality, and when those two things come together, I get the reaction of stress. So the simple example that we always use for this idea, I'm at a social event and I see my wife talking to a handsome stranger and I feel jealous. Okay, so this is a form of stress. The trigger is my wife's enjoying the company of another man. The cause is not that. The cause of my jealousy is my own attachment and possessiveness. So this is the underlying cause that interacts with the trigger. When we talk about mindfulness, and let's just go back to the definition, it's really just open attention to the present. In fact, you could even say it's negative, because if you look at your own jealousy, to stay with this example, and don't judge it as good or bad, then you haven't taken the next logical step. Jealousy is bad. You can't say that jealousy is a neutral reaction to something which is entirely normal and healthy. We should have that ethical and analytical framework that underlies our observation of our present moment. Jealousy is a negative thing. It is bad. We should judge it in that way so that we can redirect our attention towards something higher. This is the ethical framework. Who do I want to be? What is the correct way to conduct myself in this environment or in this situation? By merely allowing ourselves to look at what we're experiencing without giving it any sort of critical analysis, we don't change the way that things are. There's going to be no spontaneous growth, or we're not going to naturally orient ourselves towards a higher morality just by being aware of what our thoughts and feelings are doing. That sort of reorientation towards the higher comes through an ethical framework of understanding what higher actually means, what morality is, and finding an analytical method to interact with our own moral compass. Why am I feeling stressed? Why am I feeling jealous? Because I'm attached. That underlying cause I need to address. If I simply apply the practice of mindfulness, then what happens is I am calming the mind of my stress, but I'm not doing anything to necessarily ensure that I don't experience it next time around. So this is from the internal perspective, is that being merely aware of thoughts and feelings isn't going to give us a redirection and a growth of the personality. And the same is true when we look at the external. So there's a few potentially negative side effects of mindfulness. And I want to say that these potentially negative side effects are not inherent in mindfulness themselves, but rather only when mindfulness is taken in isolation. If all we are doing is mindfulness, then it can play into certain egocentric tendencies. Escapism. I don't like the way that this feels, so what can I do about it? Well, I'll just enter into my breath awareness, and from breath awareness I enter into emotion awareness. So in a sense, I'm escaping from the discomfort of the emotion. But escapism is not the same as growth. Another aspect, and this is, I'm quoting another author here, is that if we adopt a practice of mindfulness, and this is true for many self-development practices, traditions and so forth, it can become all about me. We are only concerned with our own well-being. If it's talking about your own happiness, one of the problems is that it neglects what this author is calling our shared vulnerabilities and interdependencies. So we've spoken about this in another context, even from the perspective of Vedanta. Vedanta says that one of the effects of spiritual growth is that you develop self-sufficiency. We become more autonomous. But the problem, if we only look at that perspective, is that I can say, well, I'm in my little bubble, I've got my little practice, and I'm feeling okay. And so we neglect the thought of the experiences and the well-being of others. As long as I'm okay, I don't care about others. And you see this in various places. You might go into someone's small home and it's clean, it's tidy. The reason it's clean and tidy is because people take the rubbish from inside their home and throw it over the boundary of their property and onto the sidewalk. My home is clean. Yes, but what about everything outside that boundary of your home? In a similar sort of way, if we use mindfulness as a way of escaping our own discomfort, then we are forgetting that there are others also. And so that can play into a failure to actually act to improve society or improve our circumstances. So we've said that the cause of stress is internal and the trigger is external. So that doesn't mean that our only responsibility is to work on the internal causes. We have an obligation to improve the society or improve the environment in which we function. There's a beautiful line of Gita. He says, "He who eats without producing is verily a thief." So we are drawing from the community, whether we consider that community to be the entire natural world, the economy of our country or our state, or whether we consider it to be our family unit and our friends and so forth. Whatever the environment we're talking about is, we're drawing some benefit from it. We have to recognize that that gives us an obligation to repay into that environment, to improve it, to leave it better than how we found it. If we have an attitude of all I need to do is to take care of my own mental well-being, then it becomes an escapism, it becomes a failure to act to improve the community. So this is coming from a quote from the online version of The Guardian. So this is an example of what we're discussing here. So he says, mindfulness programs do not ask executives to examine how their managerial decisions and corporate policies have institutionalized greed, ill will, and delusion. Instead, the practice is being sold to executives as a way to de-stress, improve productivity and focus, and bounce back from working 80-hour weeks. I don't necessarily agree with everything that the author says in this article, but this is a very interesting way to look at the mindfulness movement. It's being sold as a way to feel better about doing things which are harmful. He's basically saying that there are certain managerial decisions, corporate policies that have made the environment more difficult for us to be happy in. Look, for example, at the way social media platforms are functioning. They are designed to get you addicted. This is what they want. The thing that they're trying to grab from us is our attention, and they want it for as long as possible. The longer we stay on their platform, the more money they can generate through advertising revenue. So the way that that particular corporate policy functions is to our own detriment. We, the consumer, are going to be less well off if they succeed. Now, if you're in the corporate world and you're finding it difficult to bounce back, as he says, from your 80-hour week, so you want to de-stress, you can practice mindfulness. But what it doesn't do is get you to question what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the effect on the environment. So again, this is the problem of having a de-stressing program which is divorced from an internal moral reflection. So it's business as usual. I feel great. I take a pill and I'm relaxed and I'm calm and I'm de-stressed and I can get on doing the thing which is to the detriment of our children. Thank God for mindfulness. The other aspect of this is that it can play into our demand for immediate results and easy answers. Human nature is sticky, it's complex, it's self-contradictory, it's all these difficult things to deal with. We want easy answers. We want a quick fix for our mental anxiety. The long-term and effort-filled process of self-development is what's genuinely required to alleviate the stress that we experience living in modern life. It's a long-term process. There are no quick fixes. And yet if we're told, simply do your meditation or your mindfulness practice once a day, twice a day, and you'll find mental peace, it can play into that demand for quick fixes and immediate answers. It's a bit like the advertising you sometimes see for exercise equipment. In just 5 minutes a day, you too can have rock hard abs. No, that's not going to work. That will contribute, but if you want rock hard abs, you've got to do a whole host of other things and stop doing a whole host of other things in order to look like the beautiful models that you see in the advertisement. There is no quick fix. And so when it's, again, commodified and franchised and sold in this way, it can play into these human frailties and weaknesses for immediate results and easy answers. So what would Vedanta say then as a solution to this? Certainly not to get rid of mindfulness, but rather to improve it. So we've got an example here. If you have acid reflux, you don't simply take an antacid once or twice a day. Yes, you do take the antacid so that your agitated digestive system can be calm. But you also look for the cause of that acid reflux and ways to address it so that you can, over time, let's say, diminish the amount of antacid that you take and eventually get rid of it. Imagine it was the same way for mindfulness, that instead of having to practice 3 times a day, I really don't hardly need to practice my mindfulness at all. Why? Because all of the causes of my agitation, the causes of worry and anxiety, which keep my mind going to past and future rather being in the present, they have been diminished. And so we would naturally already be in the present moment. We don't have to practice something to get there. So Vedanta would say then keep the mind calm through your mindfulness practice if you have a particular appreciation for it, by all means. But at the same time, reduce selfishness through an integrated self-development program. So the cause of the mind not being in the present, the cause of our mental agitation and suffering is selfishness, as distinct from external triggers. So that integrated self-development program is the 3 disciplines that we've discussed at length. We elevate the emotions through a practice of gratitude and devotion. We seek truth in all aspects of life, both external and internal. So that means when we function in the external world, we look for facts, we look for reason, we look for evidence so that we can draw conclusions. And when we function in the internal world, we look for our own motivations, we look for the underlying causes of our thoughts, feelings, and etc. And importantly, and especially in terms of what we've been covering here, the 3rd aspect of a self-development practice is to act to change and improve the world. We have to actively deploy a higher moral framework in the world, rather than simply putting ourselves into a little bubble of mindfulness and feeling better about our circumstances. We actively work to improve circumstances for everybody. So he's very clear on this in the Bhagavad-Gita. He uses this word more than once, loka sangraha. The word loka sangraha means wishing the welfare of the world. So Krishna says to Arjuna, find an action that is in line with your nature, your swadharma, and then express it wishing the welfare of the world by functioning towards an ideal that is beyond your own self-centered interests. So this is a sort of a way of looking at mindfulness from the Vedantic perspective, which tries to make it a little bit more complete.